Welcome to Windfields Farm in Oshawa, Ontario, traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, Hiawatha, Curve Lake, and Alderville First Nations, and the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, and Beausoleil First Nations. Today we will be visiting the former core of Windfields Farm and the grave of the legendary Canadian thoroughbred and sire of sires, Northern Dancer. And today is a particularly special day. Its doors open in Oshawa, and the first time in nearly 10 years the public has been allowed access to the core of Windfields Farm and to pay respects to Northern Dancer. So we will take full advantage of this rare opportunity to explore the history of the farm and discover the story of the most iconic steed it produced. Let's go. Here we are at Windfields Farm, and over here is the grave of Northern Dancer himself. Before it was Windfields Farm, it was Parkwood Stable, established by Samuel McLaughlin of the local McLaughlin Car Motor Company, later General Motors Canada. And over the next 14 years, Parkwood would go on to establish numerous successful thoroughbreds that would go on to win numerous Canadian races. McLaughlin sold Parkwood Stable in 1950 to Edward Plunkett Taylor, or E.P. Taylor, a wealthy business mogul and tycoon of the beverage and alcohol industry. Taylor subsequently renamed it the National Stud Farm and later Windfields Farm after his home in Toronto. As a student at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, E.P. Taylor had witnessed the deterioration of Quebec's horse racing and breeding industry. Not wanting Ontario to suffer the same fate, he invested heavily into racetrack improvements and the importation of better studs and broodmares with winning pedigree. He started his renovations by renovating the old Woodbine Racetrack, later called Greenwood, and building a new Woodbine in Etobicoke, Ontario. To improve breeding, Taylor acquired a stud from Kentucky named Chop Chop, who's actually buried right here behind me. And he is the grandson of U.S. Triple Crown winner Gallant Fox. Chop Chop became the leading sire in Canada for 5 straight years, with 4 of his progeny going on to win the Queen's Plate, 2 of which are buried at Windfields. Now, before I continue, a brief about the Queen's Plate, or King's Plate. Founded in 1860 with a prize and trophy donated by Queen Victoria, Canada's first monarch, it is the oldest continuously run race in North America and the most prestigious in Canada, exclusive for 3-year-olds, foaled in Canada. Since Queen Victoria was its first patron, the race bore the name the Queen's Plate. When the monarch of Canada was a king, it bore the name the King's Plate. It was once again the Queen's Plate during the 70-year reign of Queen Elizabeth II, who attended the race 4 times. And with the ascension of King Charles III in 2022, the race is once again currently called the King's Plate. Taylor's continual investments finally paid off in 1961 with the foaling of Northern Dancer. Having good pedigree is essential to any racehorse, and Northern Dancer was no different. His sire was Nearctic, Canadian Horse of the Year of 1958. His dam was Natalma, whose promising racing career was cut short by injury. His dam sire was Native Dancer, one of the top U.S. horses in 1953 and a near U.S. Triple Crown winner. His grandsire was Neararco, Italian Horse of the Year in 1938. He is also a direct descendant of Hyperion, the Epsom Derby and St. Leger Stakes champion in 1933, 2 of the jewels of the English Triple Crown. Make no mistake, Northern Dancer had impeccable pedigree. Northern Dancer inherited his sire and dam sire's explosive energy and personality, but his conformation and shape he inherited from his dam, making him smaller than the average stallion and not much bigger than a pony. Not much was thought of Northern Dancer due to his size, but his small stature enamored him to E.P. Taylor's wife, Winifred, or Winnie Taylor, and it was Winnie Taylor who gave Northern Dancer his name, taking inspiration from the names of his sire and Damsire. In 1962, Northern Dancer was put up for auction at Windfields' annual yearling sale with 48 others. His price was $25,000, a steal in hindsight, but there was no buyer. Despite his impeccable pedigree, his small size cast doubt on buyers. So he remained here at Windfields with the Taylors, who were determined to make the diminutive colt a champion. Northern Dancer was a difficult horse to tame and train, often biting at the grooms and bucking off riders. His trainer was an Argentinian named Horacio Luro, a decorated trainer who had just trained the 1962 Kentucky Derby champion decidedly. Northern Dancer's strong hindquarters gave him a powerful gallop, but his behavior made him questionable as a racehorse, who could prove dangerous to himself and others. Luro suggested to Taylor to have Northern Dancer gelded, but Taylor curtly refused. Northern Dancer responded well to Luro's patient training style, and by the time he was 2 years old, had been trained to put up impressive track times. And by the time he reached maturity at a height of 15.2 hands, or 62 inches, Northern Dancer was ready to race. Northern Dancer made his debut at Fort Erie Racetrack in a maiden race against 7 others. His rider was a Canadian apprentice jockey from Windfields named Ron Turcotte from Grand Falls, New Brunswick. Northern Dancer ran the race sticking near the front of the pack, and when he came next to the first place horse, he didn't break away. So Turcotte gave him one strike of the crop, and Northern Dancer, quote, just took off. Northern Dancer won the race by 6 3/4 lengths, with Turcotte noting, "This is the best 2-year-old in Canada for sure." Northern Dancer's talents were on full display, and he would win 7 of his 9 starts for the rest of his 2-year-old season, including 4 stakes wins, never finishing lower than 3rd. The next season in 1964, Northern Dancer, now a 3-year-old thoroughbred, was eligible for the Kentucky Derby and the other U.S. Triple Crown races. To qualify, Northern Dancer would have to traverse the road to the Kentucky Derby, a series of prep races, and he would win the Flamingo Stakes, the Florida Derby, and the Bluegrass Stakes, and earned one of the 12 spots in the Run for the Roses, the Kentucky Derby, at Churchill Downs in Louisville, Kentucky. The betting favorite going into the Kentucky was an American thoroughbred from California named Hill Rise, who was 4 inches taller and larger than Northern Dancer, with a huge stride and had won his last 8 starts. Even though Northern Dancer had won his last 4 races, many doubted the ability of such a small horse to win the Kentucky, especially one that was Canadian bred. In fact, Hill Rise's jockey for the race was Bill Shoemaker, who had previously ridden Northern Dancer to victory at the Flamingo Stakes and Florida Derby. And Shoemaker was offered to ride Northern Dancer for the Kentucky, but he declined, believing that despite having never previously ridden Hill Rise, it was Hill Rise who gave him the best chance at a Kentucky Derby victory. Northern Dancer's jockey for the Kentucky was Bill Hartack, who had previously won in 1957 and 1960, and in 1962 won with Luro on the horse decidedly. 3 years of training and racing all came down to what is known as the most exciting 2 minutes in sports, and Northern Dancer was going to have to make the most of those 2 minutes. Drawing in the 7th position, he initially resisted entering the starting gate, but when he was ready, the gates opened and the race began.
Away to a good start, Mr.
Upon entering the home stretch, Northern Dancer gained the lead, but Hill Rise was quickly gaining behind him. It was coming down to the wire.
In front by a length, Hill Rise is gaining on him. It's coming to the wire.
But Northern Dancer crossed first by the length of a neck. Northern Dancer had won, shocking the American crowd by becoming the first Canadian-bred horse to win the Kentucky Derby. In the process, Northern Dancer's time of 2 minutes flat set a Kentucky Derby record that stood for 9 years until it was broken by the current record of 1 minute 59:04 set by the legendary horse Secretariat in 1973. I'm visiting here today on May 4th, 2024, and 2 days ago marked the 60th anniversary of Northern Dancer's Kentucky Derby triumph. And since today is the first Saturday in May, it is the 150th running of the Kentucky Derby. And yet, Northern Dancer's record still remains the third best in its history. I previously mentioned Secretariat, who was regarded as the greatest racehorse in history. And when he won his record-setting 1973 US Triple Crown, his jockey was none other than Canadian Ron Turcotte, Northern Dancer's first jockey. Just a small connection between the two of them. The Kentucky Derby is known as the Run for the Roses due to the winning horse being adorned with a garland of roses. The tradition has made the flower a symbol of the race, and this is why roses specifically are placed at Northern Dancer's grave. Two weeks later was the next jewel of the US Triple Crown, the Preakness Stakes, at Pimlico Racecourse in Baltimore, Maryland. And despite the historic Kentucky Derby win, Northern Dancer was still only second favorite to Hillrise. It was a rematch between the two rivals. But this time, it was no contest. Northern Dancer defeated the field of 6 by a margin of 2 1/4 lengths. The Scoundrel second, Hillrise third. Northern Dancer had proven to the doubters that his Kentucky Derby victory was not just pure luck. And with 2 jewels of the US Triple Crown, he had a chance of becoming the first US Triple Crown champion since Citation in 1948. All he had to do to seal it was to win the Belmont Stakes 3 weeks later. The Belmont Stakes in 1964 were held at Aqueduct Racetrack in New York City. At a length of 12 furlongs, the Belmont is longer than the other 2 crown races. With the Triple Crown on the line, Northern Dancer was finally the betting favorite going into the race. Finally, a Canadian was beating the Americans at their own game and had a chance to take the Triple Crown. Energy and fervor were high in Canada since one of their own had never reached the pinnacle of any international sport, and Northern Dancer was making history. But the long length of the Belmont took its toll on Northern Dancer, whose small stride was now a factor in this marathon. And heading down the stretch, which would have been the moment to unleash that explosive energy, Quadrangle and Roman Brother broke away from Northern Dancer, who failed to keep up. Quadrangle crossed first, Roman Brother second behind by 2 lengths. Northern Dancer finished third behind by 6 lengths. Hillrise placed 4th. Quadrangle, who placed 5th at the Kentucky and 4th at the Preakness, had pulled off the upset. Even with the 3rd place finish, the Taylors, Horatio Luro, Bill Hartack, and all of Canada were inconsolable on their spoiled bid for the US Triple Crown. But what went wrong? Was it the race length? Was it Hartack holding Northern Dancer back as E.P. Taylor believed? No one, however, blamed Northern Dancer, with Hartack saying, "How can you blame a horse who tries his best?" Despite the disappointing finish, Northern Dancer returned to Canada to triumphant fanfare. But he still had one more race to go, the all-Canadian Queen's Plate at Woodbine Racetrack in Etobicoke, Ontario. Northern Dancer was coming home. Northern Dancer had not been back to Canada since November of 1963, and everyone expected him to handily defeat the field of 8 at the 104th Queen's Plate, being the Kentucky Derby and Preakness champion. The hero was home, and the Woodbine Grandstand was packed with 31,000 fans wanting to see the Canadian thoroughbred champion in action, and bellowed in cheers as his name was called. But Hardtack noticed something about Northern Dancer. He was favoring his left foot. But it was too late to pull out now. This was Northern Dancer's shot at redemption for the Belmont, and in front of an adoring Canadian crowd. The grandstand was silent until the gate sprang open and all the racers bolted out. But Northern Dancer seemed sluggish and struggled at the back of the pack. By the half-mile mark, Northern Dancer was dead last. The crowd was appalled at this shameful performance from their champion. But at the 3/4 of a mile mark, Northern Dancer began to surge. Like a Hollywood movie, he glided past the middle four riders.
And Northern Dancer. And now it's Northern Dancer on the outside, Grand Garçon in the center, and Langcrest along the
right. The crowd erupted as Northern Dancer claimed the lead at the final turn. And down the stretch, he soared. Northern Dancer was alone in front when he crossed the finish line.
Coming down the wire, Canada's great little horse, Northern Dancer, wins handily by 7. Langcrest gets the second.
The champion was a champion again. Though no one knew it at the time, this was to be Northern Dancer's last dance. It was discovered that Northern Dancer was suffering from a bowed tendon. Efforts to mend the injury failed, and he retired from racing that November. In a career that lasted less than a year, he had won 14 out of 18 races, never finishing below third, and earned a total of $580,647. But his next career move would prove even more lucrative. Northern Dancer proved himself to be a champion of his pedigree, and now it was his chance to produce would-be champions of his own. Despite the offer of millions from other stables for ownership of Northern Dancer, E.P. Taylor turned them all down and declared Northern Dancer would stand for stud service at Windfields in 1965. His first breeding attempt was with one of Taylor's fillies here at Windfields, named Flaming Page, a Queen's Plate champion herself. And even though he was highly enthusiastic, his first time was as awkward as anyone's. And while it wasn't a factor on the racetrack, his small stature was an issue in the breeding shed when he struggled to get on top of Flaming Page. And in the frustration, Flaming Page kicked him twice in the ribs, and the attempt was discontinued. The hands at Windfields came up with a solution to dig a hole in the breeding shed to allow the mare to stand at a lower elevation while Northern Dancer made the cover. And with this arrangement, Northern Dancer's second attempt with Flaming Page was a success, and she was in foal. Northern Dancer had no problems for the rest of his first year in stud service, and was a busy boy, being bred to 34 mares and siring 21 foals. In 1968, in order to breed with mares more accessible in the United States, E.P. Taylor had Northern Dancer transferred to Windfield Farms' operation in Chesapeake City, Maryland. With Northern Dancer's progeny earning a reputation as winners and champions, his stud fee rose to hundreds of thousands of dollars, with the yearlings he sired also going for that amount. By the 80s, Northern Dancer's stud fee rose to a range of $500,000 to $1 million, with no guarantee. In 1982, a yearling sired by Northern Dancer by the mare My Bumpers, named Snarfy Dancer, was the first colt to be sold for over 10 million United States dollars, 31 million today. Of all of Northern Dancer's many decorated progeny, I want to mention Nijinsky II, whom he sired here with Flaming Page at Windfields. Nijinsky was sold by E.P. Taylor to an owner in the UK for $84,000, and he ended up becoming the 1970 English Triple Crown winner, and still remains the most recent winner. Nijinsky went on to become the leading sire in the UK, passing on Northern Dancer's bloodlines across the pond. By the end of his stud career in 1987, Northern Dancer sired 635 foals, 467 winners, and 147 stakes winners, and was the most successful sire of the 20th century, with many of his progeny going on to be leading sires themselves, earning Northern Dancer the moniker, the sire of sires. Today, almost all thoroughbreds can trace their lineage back to Northern Dancer. To best illustrate this, I mentioned today is the 150th running of the Kentucky Derby, and I was able to trace all 20 competitors back to Northern Dancer, including the winner, Mystic Dan, the great-great-great-great-grandson of Northern Dancer. All in all, Northern Dancer's earnings from stud fees alone tallied $117,752,000. And considering Horatio Luro wanted him gelded when he was 2 years old, E.P. Taylor was wise not to listen. E.P. Taylor suffered a stroke in the early 80s and passed ownership of Windfields Farm to his son Charles in 1983. E.P. Taylor passed away in 1989 at the age of 88, reuniting with his wife Winnie Taylor, who passed away in 1982. In 1987, it was noticed that Northern Dancer, already being an older stallion, had become less enthusiastic about his stud work. It was discovered that Northern Dancer was suffering from a slew of ailments, and he was pensioned from stud service. 3 years later, Northern Dancer was suffering from colic, causing him intense pain. Given his advanced age and low probability of surviving the procedure, the difficult decision was made to put him to rest. Northern Dancer passed away on November 16, 1990, 18 months after E.P. Taylor at the age of 29. His remains were placed in a satin-lined oak coffin and transported in a refrigerated van back to Canada and arrived at Windfields, Oshawa the next day. His remains were laid to rest that evening, and in attendance were Charles Taylor and the horses sired by Northern Dancer. The Northern Dancer's incredible story is over. The story continues with what remains of Windfields Farm today. Charles Taylor passed away in 1997 at the age of 61. Management of Windfields passed over to his widow Noreen and his sister Judith. And seeing the decline of the farm, especially with the sprawl of the city of Oshawa encroaching on its fence, they decided to slowly liquidate, starting with their horses intact, equipment, and then the 1,600 acres of land. The northern portion is now commercial space, with the eastern parcel going to housing developments. These developments still preserve Windfields' history, with many of the streets bearing the names of notable thoroughbreds and locations associated with Windfields, and of course, a street and school named for Northern Dancer himself. The southwest portion now hosts the campuses of two post-secondary institutions, Durham College and Ontario Tech University, who currently jointly own and operate the Windfields Farm Core, now an agricultural research center. The Taylors transferred the core to Durham College and the then UOIT for the purpose of preservation. But after the transfer, it was reported the property was the target of constant vandalism and had fallen into decay, with Northern Dancer's grave being covered in weeds. As a result of the public outcry over this desecration, the city of Oshawa stepped in as a partner in the preservation of the Windfields core, and they ensured that OTU and Durham College provided proper ground maintenance and security of the property. The core was restored in 2013 and made accessible during Doors Open Oshawa in 2014. Ironically, since Doors Open 2014, OTU and Durham College have kept Windfields behind closed doors. In 2015, they released a joint document titled Campus Master Plan, and in it they detailed plans for a northern campus with the core of Windfields as its focal point. But since then, no progress or updates have been made. Windfields was made accessible today for Doors Open 2024 for the occasion of the City of Oshawa's centennial. As of 2024, there isn't really much left to say, but hopefully one day, Northern Dancer and the rest of the Windfields core will be publicly accessible to allow future generations to pay their respects to a significant figure in Canadian history. Northern Dancer at Windfields Farm, here in Oshawa, Ontario. Thanks for watching.